nuclear physics research operated by the U.S. Department of Energy. At Jefferson Lab, scientists can advance our understanding of matter itself by probing quarks and gluons in the atom's nucleus with beams of electrons from the superconducting accelerator. Jefferson Lab has an educational mission as well. The Jefferson Lab Science Series features scientists and engineers who are gifted in making their work not only informative but fun. The Science Series is held once a month in the Jefferson Lab Auditorium. The presentation is live, spontaneous, and unrehearsed.
Good evening. My name is Elton Smith. I have the pleasure this evening to welcome our Tim Smith, who will be our speaker this evening. I've known Tim for about 10 years, and as he was working as an experimentalist here at Jefferson Lab. Just to recount a story, one of the projects that we were involved in required building a small detector around one of the experimental targets. And it had to be very thin, and we really didn't know how to build it. So Tim kind of came up with a really very clever idea of how to put it together. And I was never sure it was really going to work, but he convinced us to go forward with it. And I'm happy to report that we put it together about 5 years ago, and it's working very well ever since. But Tim didn't start out his career as an experimentalist. He got his undergraduate degree at the State University of New York in 1982, and then he went to the University of Massachusetts at Lowell and got his PhD there doing theoretical work on the decay of charmed mesons. He then kind of changed careers a little bit and went into experiment. And at the University of New Hampshire, he worked at Jefferson Lab here and also at Bates and at NECEF. Then he was hired at Bates as a computer scientist and did work there. For the past several years in his spare time, he's been writing a book about the structure of subatomic particles. And that's what he's going to tell us about this evening. Please welcome Tim Smith.
Thank you, Elton. There's a lot of stuff that's fairly interesting. For instance, one thing is I'm going to be talking about quarks. And quarks are these exotic things that when I went to high school, they weren't in the curriculum. When I went to college, they weren't even in the textbooks. But where are quarks? And you kind of think that quarks are something that you go to a big lab and they do something with quarks there. But quarks are not just in big labs. Quarks are everywhere. We're made of quarks. We're every gram of material, teaspoon of material has something, a septillion quarks in it, whatever that means. It's one of those numbers that I actually had to look up in the dictionary what a septillion was. But let me first off pose the question of how can we see things that we can't see? And how can we know something about particles which are too small to see? So first off, I'm going to just talk about how can we know things about things that we can't see. And so I'm going to start out over here with a small demonstration. I've got this device here. Okay, you just see a shadow of it up on the screen. But it actually exerts a force. And how would you know that it's got a force coming up? Force, you kind of think it's like a rope pulling something. And you don't see any ropes or strings or anything coming out of this. How do you know there's a force coming out of it? Well, I suppose I could wait for an answer, or I could give you one of my favorite answers, which this is a good indicator of a force. Because, of course, this is just a simple magnet. But a magnet, which you're all used to, and you've got dozens of these on your refrigerator at home, exerts a force. And we can detect it with something as simple as a compass. So, oops, maybe I should have had you do this. My first question, so how can you detect a mysterious force? You can do it sometimes with just very simple things. I want to give you a small demonstration here. And what I have here, I'm going to see if I can do this. Tell me in the audience whether you guys can see this effect. I've got a laser here, much as here. And I'm going to be shining there's supposed to be a wire drawn there, but it's too dark. So I'm going to shine my laser here on a wire. Do you guys see how it breaks up a little bit? Can anybody see that? Let me see if I can steady myself a bit. When I get it square on, there. Do you see how there's a little breaking up? What I've actually shined it on is a wire that came out of one of the detectors, much like the ones here at the lab. And if I was to pick a different wire, it would actually have a slightly different pattern. So, you know, sometimes what you can do is you can actually look at these patterns and you can figure out how thick the wire is. Now, this last one here is my favorite because if we had actually looked at these in detail, we'd find that the pattern here was halfway between the first two patterns. It's I actually had a volunteer in the audience once, a girl from a high school who gave me a hair. And we could mount it on my little piece of wood here. You know, the first one was 50 microns, and the second one was 150 microns, and then that third one was someplace in between. In fact, just by looking at how light bounced off of this hair, we could determine its size. So it's kind of, you know, just looking at simple things, how can you determine things that you can't see? I'm going to turn to one more device here. Sometimes we have sensitive materials. These are blocks of, it's plastic. It's much like plexiglass, but it's called a scintillator. And what I've got here is a UV lamp. This is like a dark lamp, or sometimes they're called party lamps or something like that. And you can see how it's converted, but you can't see here. You can't see the UV, right? But in front of certain materials, it changes color. It's kind of it's a pretty glow. Actually, Elton was able to supply me with two more that I didn't have. What do you think of this one? It's kind of a nice big piece. And this one here, it converts it to a different shade. What do you think? Anybody want that one? What do you think, blue or green? Blue? What's that? But, so, you know, by doing, you know, there are very simple things that you can do to see things you can't see. You can't see magnetism, you can't see these, the UV. One last thing I want to mention is rainbows. I love rainbows. You know, they're just pretty. And I tend to think, but I've never seen this proved, that they're one of the few things in nature that really is round. But one thing about rainbows is that they tell us a lot. You know, of course, that rainbows break up color into the colors of the spectrum, right? Into the red, the orange, the green, the blues, and so forth. But we can do a little bit more than that. We can use rainbows, our related spectrums. This is a cartoon of a spectrum that you get when you heat up hydrogen. And hydrogen will have this very characteristic pattern. Certain parts of the rainbow show up well. The red, the blue, the violet, the purple. But what I want you guys to think about is this graph right here. Because spectrums that you've seen like this can be converted into graph. And here all we did was we said, oh, we got a lot of red, so therefore there's a big spike in my graph. And here we didn't get much violet, so there's just a little spike. But this is called a spectrum. It's just like your spectrum that you're used to, only it's not as colorful, but it's the same information. That sort of information is going to be really, really important when we start to look at the subatomic, the subnuclear world. One last thing I want to talk about, just because it's another sensitive device. First off, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what cosmic rays are, and then I have a little video. Cosmic rays come from outer space, they're cosmic, but about 10 miles up or so, they hit our atmosphere and they shower particles that come down. And so here's a factoid that you can drop on all your friends, that every cubic meter, that's a little bit smaller than this table, gets hit by 100 cosmic rays, or these are truly called secondary cosmic rays, every second. So can we show that video? What this video, we made this last week. This is a cloud chamber, and a cloud chamber is a box with a fog in it. That's all it's got in it. But charged particles, like cosmic rays, or passing through it, will ionize the fog, and you get these little droplets of, little droplets. So each one of these is a particle that has gone through. This, by the way, this video is made of an area about 6 inches on a side. So you can imagine, a human body, if you were looking at you from the sky, is what, a square foot or something like that. This stuff is hitting you right now. And of course, the thing is that it's been hitting you your entire life. It's been hitting humans ever since there have been humans. And, so it's something that we do live with. But this is what's going on. And the point is that if you had a sensitive device, you can actually see these things. This device, this fog, was made of rubbing alcohol and dry ice. That was all there was to it. But, here there is stuff going on around you all the time. We don't normally see it because we don't think to look. So I'm going to actually switch gears a little bit. And I'm going to move away from what we can detect and talk a little bit about what we think is in there. And, well, you guys will recognize this bottom part as the periodic table of the elements. What you probably might recognize is that here I mean an electron and a proton and a neutron. You might recognize that. These are a list of some of the particles that we talk about nowadays, or that they were talking about prior to 1964. In the 50s, scientists had been doing a lot of studies. They had been discovering all these other strange particles, the ones here in the Greek alphabet, muons, pions, taus, etas, omegas, lambdas. And what were they going to do with these? Well, what people wanted to do is they said, hey, those chemists were awfully clever. And the chemists figured out how to take all the things that they knew about and they put them in a nice table, and there was some sort of order and reason behind this table. Now, this table is great. I don't know. I know there's a lot of high school students in here, so how many have taken their chemistry so far? Anybody taking chemistry? Yeah, great. This is good. But, what I say you guys will already know. But here in chemistry, why did they put these in the same column? Well, they had the same properties. This is, the famous noble gas column. They have the same properties. They're all gases. They all have the same property. What about why are these in the same row? Well, they're in the same row. We now know that this guy has 1 electron and 1 proton, and that guy has 2, and this one has 3 and 4, and they go up, right? But when you then learned about it in physics class, you'd say, this guy, of course, in the outer orbit of an atom, there are 2 electrons. So, of course, these are the things that have 1 orbit. And these guys have a second orbit that can be held by more electrons. And Mendeleev, the guy who invented this, Dmitri Mendeleev, he didn't know anything about the inside of atoms. He knew about properties. He knew that carbons look like, whatever he put next to carbon, right? He knew that the noble gases go together because they have the same properties. He knew that the alkalines were over here because they had the same properties. So he arranged them by properties. Later on, we found out that the properties reflected the structure on the inside. One of the curious things was he also increased weight as he went up by mass, right? There was one element that people said, Dmitri, you've messed up. By mass, these two should be swapped. And he said, no, I kept them by property because property was more important. And it had to, years and years later, we understood this in terms of isotopes and so forth. But it was looking at properties that gave you the arrangement, and the arrangement later on can help you understand structure. So now all those funny particles that I mentioned at the beginning, kaons, pions, whatever they are, well, what do you do with them? Well, here's one thing you could have done with them. is let's say we arrange them by charge. That's a pretty good property. Some are positive, some are negative, some are neutral. And how about mass? Mass is another good property. And what you get is you get this kind of useless pattern. You know, this doesn't tell you much. You get these strange arrangements of kaons, all these weird particles, and they don't seem to lay themselves out like a table. Well, in 1964, when the quark theory was first proposed, what they said is, oh, guys, those are not what we should use. We should not use charge, and we should not use mass. We should use something called, a different property called strangeness, and one called isospin. And then everything has this nice pattern. These were called an octet. This is another octet. Here's a dectet. I'll tell you what strangeness is in a moment. Isospin, by the way, is how much does it look like a proton versus how much does it look like a neutron. So you see these guys. Here's the neutron and the proton that you're used to seeing. They're up there nicely. But when they first proposed this, when they first drew this up, these patterns are sometimes referred to as the eightfold way, which has that Eastern influence. This particle was not seen. This is called the omega minus. And so people put this up, and they said, a nice pattern, but there's something missing. There's no omega minus. And well, of course, once you've made a prediction, they could do other things. Like they said, well, we kind of know how much these guys weigh. This guy would probably weigh a little bit more by about, and they could make some predictions. They knew its charge. They said, the omega minus will have a -1 charge. It'll be like an electron, which has a -1 charge. This is one of my all-time favorite photographs. This was taken at Brookhaven in 1964. And on the right is the explanation of what's going on here. But there's a particle beam coming in at the bottom. And there's something happened right here. And there's this small stretch here. And, it's a great piece of detective work to be able to look at a photograph like this and say, it's the omega minus. Well, they had magnetic fields, and they know things like particles in magnetic fields curve, and they curve more if they're slow, and they curve less if they're fast, or if they have higher momentum. And eventually, they were able to work out, well, we know this is a proton, and they could work it all the way back down to the omega minus. So right there was the discovery of the omega minus. So this was published in February 1964. And in some sense, it was a vindication of the pattern that we saw in the previous slide. So, what are quarks, and where are quarks? Well, here's my scale. This is a logarithmic scale, so every step here is going down by a factor of 10. Again, one of my all-time favorite movies is a movie called Powers of 10, and it shows what a nerd I am, and I like that movie. But it takes the premise of what does the world look like every time you go down by a factor of 10. So, hearts are roughly 10 times smaller than humans, and snowflakes are smaller than that, and sand and cells and cell nucleons and so forth. Actually, I like to break this up into 3 big steps. If you go down from a human down by 5 steps here, so this is a factor of 100,000 smaller than a human, you're at the size of a red blood cell. That's kind of a typical cell. It's about 1/100,000th of your size. It also happens to be the thickness of tinfoil, which this is a new fact to me recently. So that's 100,000 times smaller than you are. 100,000 times smaller than that is an atom. So here, 5 steps down more is the atom. Okay. Now, this is one of those strange spots in nature where there's not much else for the next 100,000. You go from the size of an atom down here to the size of a nucleon, which is a weird word. Okay, nucleon means proton or neutron. I can't decide. Okay, it's a word. It's a generic term for proton or neutron. But that's the same jump as going in between the human and the red blood cell, or the red blood cell and the atom, is from the atom down to the size of a neutron or proton. What we do is we look around that region. So things slightly larger are a nucleus. That's the center of an atom. Things slightly smaller are things like constituent quarks. And then down here, well, who knows exactly how small is a real quark? Perhaps 0. It's hard to draw 0 on the same plot. So that's where our hidden world is. What about quarks? I mean, here's this particle it's clearly got to be incredibly complicated and clever to understand it, right? Well, I don't think so. If you write down everything there is to know about a quark, you can tell a quark by its charge, like an electron has a charge. By its color charge, it has another charge. That's a color charge. It's a little bit tricky, but it's just like a charge. It has something called a spin, and it has something called a flavor. And you know what? That's about it. There's not much else you can say about quarks. You can classify them and do experiments and so forth, and you can't find any other property than these. So when you're given this, what can you do with that? First off, of those properties, spin is kind of an interesting one. It's also something that I'm going to try to explain a little bit what we mean when we say spin. Because, I can understand when a baseball pitcher throws a ball, you can say he puts spin on it, right? He puts a bit of curve on it. Well, that's fine. I can understand a ball that's big spinning, right? But if I had something that was so small it didn't even have any distance across, whoa. I mean, what does that mean? Something that is of 0 dimension is spinning. I don't know what that means. So when I say it as a physicist, what does it mean? Well, this is as best I can do. I can say that it acts like it has spin. And that's really all we're going to be able to do. All these properties is we say they act like they have charge, like they have spin, like they have mass. I think I'm going to try out this other pointer. So, what does something that has spin act like? Well, here's a pool table, and if you hit a ball and you hit the cushion and you hit it right square on, it kind of comes off it reflects, right? It comes off at the same angle it went in at. That's just straight. You just hit the ball, and that's what happens. Spin, well, if you were to hit the ball on one edge and give it a bit of spin, you know that when it hits the cushion, it acts differently, right? Who's played pool? Who's played pool? And you know that, if you're really good, you use this, and if you're really bad like me, this just happens, right? It goes off in the direction you don't want it to go. And if you hit it one way, it kind of curves outward, and if you spin it the opposite way, it kind of bites into the cushion, and it makes a more shallow bounce. In a very real sense, that's all we can say when we say these particles have spin, is we really know that if you collide them with something, they act as if they had spin. They either scatter less than we thought they would, or they scatter more, and it's because of the spin property. That's all you really can see. What about flavor? Flavor is an interesting thing. Quarks come in 6 flavors. It's not quite Baskin and Robbins, right? It's not. Or what's the local ice cream place around here? I don't know how many flavors you have. There's a Ben & Jerry's near where I live that has, I think, 35 flavors or something. There are 6 flavors here, and the word flavor is this flippant word that all of quarks are full of these flippant words, and I tend to think it's because they were invented in the 60s, and it was really groovy. And what else would you say? Things were charmed and strange. But flavors were you had to give each species a name, right? And back in the 40s and 50s, everything got these Greek names, and they sounded very sober. And then in the 60s, the flower power or something, and the word quark, where does that come from? But so people said, well, up and down, those were clear. They were opposite. They date back to that isospin idea. Isospin was like a spin, only protons were spinning up, or had isospin up, I should say, and neutrons had this opposite thing. The other thing was that quarks then, these got heavier and they were harder to find. So they, up and down, they knew about. Later they found this strange one. This, by the way, is what makes that omega minus, had 3 of these quarks. And then the charm, bottom, and finally the top, which is just found about a decade ago. I think this is curious, and I almost think it's a psychology and sociological question of exactly why these things got named. Well, up is more like a proton, as down is more like a neutron. That's simple enough. Charm and strange, this is a different picture from someplace else. This was actually a picture where something is coming in from the top. These were seen in balloons. They would take photographic plates and they would hang them from balloons and they'd fly them up to where those cosmic rays were, 10 miles up. And what they were seeing was stuff streaming down here. But here is something where a particle has decayed, and you don't know what it was. It was neutral, but it decayed. And for a while, they said, well, whatever it was, it formed this upside-down V. So it became called the lambda particle, because that looks like the Greek symbol lambda. But that was something strange was going on, and so the word strange was coined. A few years later, they found the counterpart to strange called charm. Well, they found the counterpart to strange, and they had to think of what to call it. And they knew it was a counterpart, so then they were stuck with up and down. That's obviously a pair. Whoever picked out strange, we've got to come up with something opposite of strange, and charm was the best they could do. Now, there are two more flavors left, and these are kind of interesting in their names. We now call them top and bottom, but they used to be called truth and beauty. And, truth and beauty is kind of a cool name. But, what's the problem with treating those as opposites? And finally, I realized the problem was right here that Keats had identified it. Truth is beauty, and beauty is truth, and that is all you need on Earth and all you need to know. Well, of course, that's not going to work to describe two things that are opposite. So maybe top and bottom is right. I don't know. Often you just see it written as T and B, which avoids the controversy completely. One last thing about quarks is they're all over. 99.95% of ordinary matter is quarks, or at least constituent quarks, or quarks and the things that hold them together. Any idea what that other 0.05 is? I'm sorry? Electrons. Electrons are not quarks, so they're their own thing. Now, I now am in a department full of lots of astronomers who say, well, we don't know what dark matter is. We don't know what dark energy is. This is the new term now, dark energy. And so therefore, I always have to append this word ordinary matter. Okay, so I'm only going to talk about the stuff that I'm made out of, the world is made out of, or the Earth is made out of, stars are made out of, neutron stars are made out of. A lot of exotic stuff, DNA is made out of this stuff, this ordinary matter. So everything you need to know about quarks to build a universe. That's it. They come in 6 flavors. There are also 6 antiquarks. What's an antiquark? Okay. An antiquark is, well, it's antimatter. That's all it is, right? Wait, anybody want to stop me there? You're supposed to say, wait a second, antimatter, as far as I remember, only appears in the Starship Enterprise, right? I think it does, right? And it drives science fiction. Well, no. Antimatter does exist. It just doesn't exist much around here. But antiquarks have the exact opposite properties of a quark, only in reverse. And sometimes, in fact, one thing that people realized was that they couldn't tell if it was really a quark or if it was an antiquark or if it was a quark going backwards in time. It was this strange property. It looks like matter, but it has the wrong orientation and direction. What about this? Everything has spin 1/2. Okay, we're talking about quarks, so that's true. And they also all have this 3 color charges. Electrons, normal, electricity, protons, that sort of thing. There's just 1 charge. It's electrical charge. Here they have 3. And again, in that really, 1960s flippant mood, what are you going to call 3 things that go together? They're called red, green, blue. And, why not? We know that if we have all 3 of them together, they all add up to white. If you have a quark and its antiquark which of course would have anti-color, that also could add up to white. But there isn't a lot to get to understand, to a lot of properties here. So I'm going to tell you how to build all the particles in nature, and I'll do it in 3 slides. First one, there are these things called mesons, okay? And they're made of a quark and an antiquark. So we have 6 different types of quarks and 6 types of antiquarks. And how many combinations do we get? 6 times 6? 36, thank you. Here you actually see 25 particles laid out, okay? And this row and this column, I talked to the people one time at Fermilab who have actually seen these. And I said, what are their names? Have you guys given them names yet? You know, this is kind of an exciting thing. Could you give them and some people say, well, of course, this one, it's got to be named something like B0 sub T. And other people, but most people said, they don't live long enough. You know, they exist, but they don't live long enough to be justified to have a name. So they're kind of nameless right now. In any case, these guys can live 10 to the minus 10 seconds. That's practically forever compared to some of these other guys. But here you've got half the universe already. All you did is you multiplied 6 times 6. Actually, though, of those, the 3 lightest ones are kind of the ones that show up most of the times. So if we multiply our 3 times 3, we get our 9 quarks, 9 mesons rather. And do you remember this pattern? This was earlier on. It's the same 9. That's all that showed was how did you put together 3 different quarks. It was a pattern. It was just addition. If we also combine the 3 lightest into our second rule, and this rule is kind of an important rule, 3 quarks combine to form something called a baryon. And a baryon, well, baryons are important because that's what protons and neutrons are. And here's the proton and the neutron on this list. But again, you know, the hard part is not that hard. It's just a little bit of multiplication. Here it gets a little bit tricky because there are permutations. You know, if I did my straight multiplying 3 times 3 times 3, I would have 27, and I don't see 27 up here because an up quark, an up quark, and an up quark looks a lot like, or an up, and a down looks like a down, and up, and you know, it's just different arrangements. So when you take permutations and combinations, that's the entire universe, more or less. It's most of the stuff in the universe. So now I want to just focus on the 2 most important ones, the stuff that we're really made out of, stuff that everything is. And this is the proton and the neutron. And the proton and the neutron are just made of, each of them are made of 3 quarks. They have some funny properties. They have, you know, 2/3 of a charge. This one has a 1/3, negative 1/3. But, you know, all that adds up to 1, which is good because since I was in high school, I was told that a proton had a 1 charge, and the neutron, I was told, was neutral. That's part of its name. It's neutral. So therefore, this plus 2/3 and minus 1/3 and minus 1/3. Okay, I can do my math. It adds up to 0. That's good. Now I want to ask one last question. Now you know what's inside of a proton and neutron. How could quarks arrange themselves? And I'm actually going to go back over here for a second. So this takes a moment to warm up. So how could 3 things arrange themselves? And again, what I want us to do is do this as a thought problem. One thing is that, you know, the Greeks were great at thought problems. I'm always amazed when I read what they did. The Greeks, not only did they know how far around it was the Earth, they knew the Earth was spherical, they knew the distance to the moon. How did they get that one? They knew roughly the distance to the sun, which meant they knew the size of the sun, roughly. Not quite, close. They knew that the universe was without bounds. The Greeks also knew conservation of energy and mass, something that people forgot for 1,000 years after that. So imagine that you're sitting in Greece in an olive grove, and somebody says to you, how do those 3 quarks arrange themselves inside of a proton and a neutron? Well, Any thoughts? So here's my three things. Three things. I just tossed them out there, right? But already, what's happened? I mean, any patterns here? Triangle? Yeah. This is one thing that even putting it on something flat has, there's a few properties in geometry that 3 points make a triangle. That's good. There is kind of one other arrangement that could be like that. That's like the only non-triangle that I can make is put them all on a straight line. And then that's not a triangle. But any place else I put them, and you can put them anywhere. You could take this penny. These are just pennies. And, I could leave those two here and take this one and take it with me back to New Hampshire, and it would still form a triangle with these two. Well, if I orient it right, if I don't line them up. So that's your first thought, is it's triangle, or it possibly could be the straight arrangement. There isn't really a lot of choice when you have three objects. So now I'm going to go back over here. If you've got just two choices like that, triangle is kind of symmetric. There's my triangle. And my row is asymmetric. The other thing we know about quarks is that the up and the down attract each other about as much as the down and the down, or the up and the up. In fact, this thing called color charge is ignorant, or at least it ignores what flavor was. So it doesn't seem to matter. I've got three quarks. They're all attracted to each other about the same, right? So what arrangement should we expect them to be in? Well, we would expect them to be like this. This is what you might call the democratic arrangement. They're all equally pulling at each other. So, this one, clearly this guy has some preference in the middle, or maybe he's rejected by both, or something is unbalanced here. And this is the most balanced one. So that's your first thought. A neutron should be like that. Now, it actually gets a little bit more complicated, and the complication is interesting, though. These guys have spin. So here's my neutron. I have two down quarks, and they have spin, and due to the way their color is and so forth, their spin lines up. Now, what happens? What happens when I have two things that spin line up? Now, spin is like a magnet. So if I had two magnets right next to each other, and their norths were both pointing up, what would happen to them? Wrong. No. Remember, opposites attract and the same repel, so they repel. So this is what we expect happens in a neutron, is that these two guys repel each other. Their spins are aligned, they push apart. This one is the opposite. It would kind of get a somewhat more central preferential position. And this is kind of an interesting question, because you in one sense think that you're going to be triangular, and in another sense you think that it's going to skew things. And if you could actually measure the shape of these guys, that would be interesting, because it would tell you which was more important, the spin repulsion or the fact that that the color charge is more democratic. Now, I think actually this diagram now, you see it's 1999, so it's already old. But this is kind of an interesting. This is kind of a compilation of data from all over the world as to the shape of the neutron. And what they look at is the charge. Now, on that previous one, maybe I should just go back for a second. What's going to happen here is that these guys are a little bit farther out from the middle, right? And they're negative. So you expect a little bit more negative on the outside of a neutron, a little bit more positive on the inside. And this is what this data here is showing us, a little bit more negative on the outside and positive on the inside. Does that surprise anybody? Neutrons are maybe a little bit more negative on the outside, positive on the inside? Is that not? This surprised me because I thought neutrons were neutral. But yeah, they are neutral. They really have to be neutral. That's one of those really true things that I was taught at some point in my life. But this is neutral. It's just that all this together, this positive here cancels that negative there. And if you were out here, you would see 0. So they really are neutral, but they have within them a little bit more structure. I'm going to just shift gears a little bit. Do you remember this diagram, this spectrum up here? This is spectrum of light, as we got from a hydrogen atom, kind of an atomic physics problem. And one thing that we have here is that this is increasing energy. This is more energetic. So a spectrum, you can also think a spectrum is counting how much light did I get at different energies. I got a graph of number of photons that came in versus energy. Well, here's another spectrum. This spectrum has energy versus number of particles that came in, only they've been modified, the numbers here. And this one, this is an old SLAC one, but it has some nice features here. Right here, it's got this great bump. It has some other bumps here. What they've done is they've hit. Remember here, what you do to get this sort of spectrum is you shine a light at hydrogen, and the electrons shift around, and they give off these colors. Here, this is an accelerator, much like Jefferson Lab. They've taken an electron, and they've hit a proton very hard, and they see at what energies does the electron come out at. And it comes out at certain energies because certain energies, there's new structure underneath there. There's something going on inside the proton at different energies. This bump here is the one I'm going to talk about. It's kind of an interesting one. And it's interesting because you hit the proton hard, somehow it soaked up the energy and then it released it. And how did it do that? Well, that kind of looks like the proton, doesn't it? Up, up, down. Does it look? It looks a little bit different. And you think about it for a while, and maybe if I flip back to the picture before, you say, hey, wait, these are all got their spins the same way. The other ones, one of them was spinned opposite. And that's all that happened, is we hit the proton hard, and a spin flipped. Now, when I first heard of this in nuclear physics, I said, oh, yeah, but I studied atomic physics before I started nuclear physics. And in atomic physics, a spin flip is something called a hyperfine splitting, and the effect is almost impossible to see. It's like, something that's down there in the 4th decimal place. It's just this tiny, tiny effect. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is that when we flip the spin, this object becomes heavy. And it's because it absorbed so much energy. And energy is mass, mass is energy. Remember that Einstein thing? Okay, so this mass here is 1,230 MeV over C. That's kind of a funny unit people like. But the only thing that's important is that here's the proton, or the neutron is this 940. It's gained 30% in its mass. That's massive. This thing has just jumped up 30% of its mass when it got hit, when it flipped its spin. That's also pretty cool. There's a lot of energy to do that. And it means that this whole mechanism of how things couple, there's a lot of energy going on in there and a lot of interesting stuff. More things. Okay, this particle is called the delta particle. It has a lifetime of 10 to the minus 24 seconds. At the speed of light, it could cross 2 protons in that time. So it's not like you're going to go down to the store and say, please, could I have a bottle of delta particles? They don't travel very far, and then they go right back into being a proton, or whatever they started out with. So we never actually see the delta. What we see are the daughter particles. The delta, here's a delta plus. It can decay into a proton and a pion, or it can decay into a neutron and a pi plus. And what we'll end up measuring is the energy of these guys coming out. So here's a nice plot where all they did is they just looked at the energy of the pions coming out. And they said, so this is one of these strange things. Have we ever seen a delta? Well, what we've seen is we've seen this plot. And we say we understand that as a delta. So we've never actually seen, we haven't even seen these things as, some of these particles are so short-lived you don't even see them as tracks or anything. You just see them as resonances. So now I'm going to give you a quick tour of the tools of the trade. And just as an introduction, briefly, accelerators and electrons. Well, if I had a microscope or a hand lens or something like that, and I was looking at a bit of pond water, You shine light at it, you get out your lens, and you look at it with your eye. You're kind of familiar with that, right? Well, the analogy at an accelerator lab is to, you have an accelerator that shines electrons at a sample, and something much like light scatters back the electrons, or possibly parts of what you were looking at, scatter into your spectrometer, and then you've got a computer to understand it. So, you know, you need, much like you needed light here and lens here, you need an accelerator, and you need a spectrometer is a large device that captures particles that have flown out, and it figures out what their energy is. Remember, spectrum is like energy. So here's my cartoon of an accelerator. You know, it's kind of funny because the lab that I've been working at for the last few years, which is up in Massachusetts, I give some tours of it. And you know, after you've given a tour for a bunch of times, you realize all an accelerator is it's a hot wire at the beginning. It's a cathode, which is the same thing you have in the back of a television tube that, you know, makes electrons that hits the front. It also has microwaves and magnets. And you know, here you've got this huge accelerator, and all it is microwaves, magnets, and a hot wire. Well, it gets more complicated. They can be using lasers here, and they can use other things. But you know, it's amazing that, well, so sometimes, I've never worked it out for Jefferson Lab, but you know, you say, well, this accelerator is the equivalent of, you know, 30,000 home microwaves or something like that, and it kind of all of a sudden brings it down to size, and it's just a big device. But the thing about a place like Jefferson Lab is that if you produce electrons 5 or 6 GeV, then you can kind of figure out the wavelength of an electron. Yeah, electrons have waves. Oh boy, this gets complicated. But electrons have waves, and the wave gets smaller at the higher energy. So the idea of building a place like Jefferson Lab is that you can make the waves around your electron about the same size as what you want to look at. You know, if I wanted to look at something small, I wouldn't be hitting it with large waves because it would just be a mushy image. So you've got to hit it with something that's about the same size as what you want to see. These are actually photographs from here, from Jefferson Lab. If you're out on Jefferson Avenue, I don't know if you've ever looked through the trees and you see the 3 bumps in the laboratory. Well, the one that's closest to us here is Hall A. They go in alphabetical order. Hall A is closest to us, and B in the middle, and C on the far side. This is kind of a grainy picture, but you know, what's happening here is electrons are coming in, they're hitting a target, and then they get curved by these large magnets up into detectors. And why do you use magnets? Well, fast-moving particles go right through a magnetic field without much deflection. Slow-moving ones get curved a lot. And so what you can do is you can spread out, you can separate fast and slow particles. And that is the same as figuring out a spectrum. So we can separate the high energy, the fast ones, from the low energy, slow ones. And that's why it's a spectrum, and that's why these massive devices are called spectrometers. I always think this guy looks like a ship. You know, it's got a deck here, and it's got gangplanks and so forth, but it's about 4 or 5 stories tall. It's a massive piece. This is class. This is the one that Elton, who did the introduction, does. The interesting thing about this device is that it's a sphere. And that means that particles can go out in any direction, and they can get detected. And, you know, but again, it's hard for me to lay out dimensions here. It's about 4-meter diameter, or radius, I'm sorry, sphere. It's a massive piece of equipment. It's a beautiful device. This is part of Hall C, and it's not a great photograph, but the thing about Hall C is that it's always changing. So, you know, if you had a photograph from 2 years ago, it probably isn't right anymore. It's an interesting spot because they have the ability to modify what they're doing. What's that? Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
People in that photo.
Where? I see the down. Oh, down there. Yeah, okay, there's somebody down here. So you can, yeah. Here's the 2 meter person, well, 1.5 meter person. And the, I don't know, what's that, 20 meters tall then? No, 10 meters. I will show you one detector which isn't here at Jefferson Lab. This is at MIT Bates Lab. This is where I've been working for the last few years. We just finished this summer. And it's a smaller detector. The reason it has a specialty which has to do with polarization and so forth. But I think I'm going to actually show you if I can figure out the key sequence. This is a movie of the building of. Oh, what happened? I've got it on my screen. Huh. That's strange. That's very strange. I just switched. Oh, I bet you. This is going to kill me, I think. Anything came back? My computer has just froze up a bit. Well, I only had 3 more slides, and I'm just going to tell you what they say. Okay? I'm sorry for that. Okay, thank you. Okay. There was a movie, which was kind of an interesting thing, because it was 18 months of building, kind of condensed down to 15 seconds. And maybe, well, there it is there. In closing, though, you know, there were interesting things. We looked at how quarks might arrange themselves inside of a neutron or a proton. We looked at, we talked a little bit about this delta particle, this excited state. Well, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And this whole field is still going on. You know, there's something called a Roper resonance. You remember how on that one figure there was several bumps, right? It went up and down and up and down. And there was that graph. What about these other bumps? What are they? You know, there's a lot of interesting ideas. One of them is that there's stuff called gluons. Gluons are the particles that hold quarks together. I mean, why don't quarks fly apart? Well, they don't because they're glued together. Well, again, one of those funky terms. I think funky is the right adjective here. Is glue. So maybe particles are glued. They have things running back and forth between them called gluons. And maybe an excited state, remember, excited state means somehow I put in lots of energy and then I get it out later on. Maybe what we've done is that glue is maybe like a rubber band that we've twanged, you know, and it's vibrating. So there's an idea. And there's a whole series of experiments worldwide to look at these problems. What about strangeness? Remember that strange quark? There's an idea that you could have strange quarks stuck inside of a proton. Wait, you're supposed to say, wait, then it'd have the wrong properties. It wouldn't have proton properties, it'd have proton plus strangeness properties. Well, what about if we put a strange quark in there and an anti-strange, something that canceled out? They canceled each other, but they're in there. Could you ever figure that out? Actually, there's been a whole series of experiments to look at strange content by various different means. What about other stuff? You know, do these delta particles exist in normal matter? Possibly. There's experiments to look at that. What about, there's something called the spin crisis. I always think it has a great name, but you can go into the literature and you read about the spin crisis. And there's this question of whether all the spin is in the quarks. Well, probably the gluons have a lot of spin too. And this is something that there's a big experiment that was done in Germany to look at that. So when I look at the whole field, you know, and Jefferson Lab is very much a focal point of it, but this whole field is a worldwide field. There's experiments in Japan, in Germany, in Russia, several places in this country, France, Italy, and so forth. And, you know, I think to myself that we're on this voyage of exploration. And I always like to talk, you know, I like to think about, you know, Captain Cook and the HMS Endeavour and the Beagle and all those ships that were sent out kind of in the late part of the 18th century. And what did they do? They charted out the ocean, the Pacific, and they were, you know, collecting plants and so forth. One of the things that they did, which, you know, is I like to look at a map of Hawaii. Has anybody ever looked at a map of Hawaii? And do you see patterns there? I mean, I have to admit that now I look at everything and I see patterns. But you look at a map of Hawaii and you see this pattern. They're all on a string of islands, right? And the big island is at one end and the littlest island is at the other end. Okay, what's the pattern? What's going on there? Well, you know, it took a long time for people to map this out, and then they could sit back and they could say, the active volcanoes on the big island, right? And the little islands are the dead volcanoes that are really old. And what's happening is that there's continental drift going on, and the plates, the continental plates are moving across a fissure where magma is coming up and forming volcanoes. But if you had not made the chart, if you had not mapped out the islands, if you hadn't figured out which one was big and which one was small and so forth, you would never see the pattern. And if you don't see the pattern, you can't figure out what's going on underneath. And I feel like that's the stage we're at now in the physics that we do here, nuclear or intermediate energy or whatever you want to call it, is that we've got a lot of really tantalizing pieces of information. There's more to find, and there's more looking at the patterns and figuring out what's going on. My final statement is that, you know, when I look at this, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I thought, this is interesting. But now I say, this entire field is getting curiouser and curiouser. So I like to quote Alice, who ends Alice in Wonderland with, curiouser and curiouser. And that's all I can say. Thank you. Are there any questions? I'd be happy. Yes? Yes. Oh, no, that's a very good question. The question was, gluons keep quarks together. What keeps gluons from going off into space? So, right, you've got to imagine that you have two quarks sitting here, and a gluon, you know, goes there, right? Now, why doesn't it go there? Why doesn't it go that way? There's a few different ways of answering that, but one of them is it took energy to make that gluon. And this is one of these strange things where, do you remember the Heisenberg uncertainty principle? This is this principle that says that I can know where something is precisely, or I can know its